Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I am very excited to be a part of this panel. My name is Elizabeth Carlin, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow with the Living Earth Collaborative here at Washington University in St. Louis. Co-hosting with me today is Dr. Brett Seymour, who is the Grossman Family postdoctoral fellow with the Living Earth Collaborative. And I just want to say this event would not be possible without the amazing support from the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Equity here at WashU. We are very, very thankful for their co-sponsorship of this event and all the support that they've given us. And I'm extremely excited to hear from all of our panelists today, who include Nathan Stanfield, the graduate student in architecture at the Sam Fox School at Washington University here in St. Louis, Michael Nelson, who's an environmental scientist with STL Sustainable Villages Consortium, Jennifer Colton, senior lecturer at the Sam Fox School in here at Washington University, Candice Borders, who's a graduate student in the American Studies and African American Studies Department at Yale University. Sylvester Brown Jr. hopefully will be joining us soon, who's a journalist and author. And Dr. Whitney Anthony Sammy, who's an assistant professor of biology at the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy here in St. Louis. Before we get to our panelists, just a little bit of housekeeping. Each panelist will give an approximately 5-minute presentation. And if you have questions or comments throughout the presentations or at any time throughout this panel, please indicate who your question is for and ask your question in the comments section of YouTube. These will then be relayed to our speakers. So first up, we have Nate Stanfield, who is, like I said, a Sam Fox Ambassador Scholar in the Master of Architecture program at Washington University in St. Louis. As a Divided City graduate fellow, he examined the effects of infrastructure and innovations on the native land and water through Tracing Our Mississippi, part of the exhibit Columbus New Middles. His degree project investigates the history and future of the waste cycle in the St. Louis area and speculates the role of architecture on its disarmament. So Nate, thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to hear from you.
Yeah, super excited to be here. And so first of all, big thank you to the Living Earth Collaborative and to the Center for Race and Ethnicity and Equity. Just super, happy to be here. So I will share my screen. Go. One sec. All right, looks like I can't do full screen, but we'll go from here. So again, super excited to be here. My name is Nathan, and I'm in my last semester in the Master of Architecture program here at WashU. And basically, for my brief intro, I'll talk a bit about the larger geographic scale as it's in my practice and research connects to the smaller scale of installation work and architecture as well. And really, for me, I think the connections and how those can drive design in the future. And so this first project was through my graduate fellowship with the Divided City this summer in Exhibit Columbus, investigating the history and future of water-based crises experienced by Native communities throughout the Mississippi River Basin. And so this is a map that's looking at the relationship between historical territories of Indigenous territories from Native lands. This is kind of open source information online and kind of comparing and juxtaposing existing reservations, the Mississippi River Basin. And really the project was about starting with these layers of information in this history and thinking about how can you communicate this in a space. And so with Derek and team, we put together initial design ideas of how a model could be interactive and help understand these complicated ideas. And really for architecture, I'm interested in how we can communicate complexity simply. And so from there, the installation was in Columbus, Indiana. And so the name is apt. And a lot of the other projects that were responding to this prompt of, how do we live together in this new middles, was looking at this relationship between the landscape and between the history and the infrastructures that really are kind of throughout. And starting to use some of the graphic hierarchy of color between red and white and black to understand and to not abstract to complicate, but rather to understand some of these deeper issues related to the built environment at a larger, more infrastructural scale. And I will say with this that the levees, pipelines and dams that are stitching and scarring across the topography are in direct contrast to the indigenous territories observed to more closely follow these topographical phenomena throughout the landscape. And so kind of zooming in here, this is the upper Mississippi Basin that you're seeing. And as the model was broken up into these smaller pieces, you start to see some of the connections that happen. And so the kind of historical context and geographically of Cahokia sits adjacent to a intersection of pipelines going across the landscape in Patoka, Illinois. And to understand this relationship between place and St. Louis really is quite connected to what's happening upstream in the St. Paul area, as well as what's happening downstream in New Orleans. And that historical and spatial relationship is being important on multiple levels. And so this research is connected for me a bit of some work with other disciplines in earth and planetary sciences and the music department. And really I'm interested in, from an architectural standpoint, how do you translate this data and these things that are otherwise more kind of accessible to smaller groups and make this understood in a different way? And so this project with the music department was translating hydrological data and thinking about how this issue of dams affecting sedimentation, and thinking about how you can take this idea that takes expertise to understand and investigation into the research, and to translate that sonically into an experience. And so this is an ongoing collaboration for an upcoming installation work through Nicole Miller's work with Kemper to really translate this data into something that's both visual, but it's also, you can hear it and you can feel it. And really that's what we care about. Like, the language of architects is experience. It's not material. That's somewhat of a myth. And so for me, that's tucked a bit into my degree project with the Sam Fox School, and responding to this existing condition of the American bottom, which Jennifer Colton, who you'll hear from later, has done fantastic work documenting and understanding this with charting the American bottom. And so for me, I'm very interested in this kind of idea of bricolage, to pull from Claude Lévi-Strauss, of how you can construct architecture from a diverse range of available things, and to think about the deeper history of Cahokia and the larger context of the Mississippi River Basin, and how does this plug into immediate contexts and architecture. And so for me, this is an in-progress thing. My review is coming up in a couple of weeks, but really it's tied down to views and to experience, and what is loud, and really how an architecture can sit in between. For me, it's the Worldwide Technology Raceway, the Milam Landfill, and Cahokia Mounds, and think about this very complicated but quite connected landscape fabric, and how an architecture can be both supportive and program as a storage facility, but also aspirational, and thinking about the kind of new future that can help us better understand our history and our context. And yeah, with that, I guess I'll hop off and save it for the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Our next speaker is going to be Michael Nelson, who is an environmental chemist at STL Sustainable Villages Consortium. He practiced laboratory science for 15 years as an environmental chemist, and an additional 15 years in the nonprofit sector, serving in various positions, working with public and private partners to improve environmental and health issues in underserved communities. He received the first environmental justice grant in St. Louis in 1994 to address lead poison and prevention. And his current projects include continuing to work as a consultant with a focus on climate justice, teaching, and travel research for a book on environmental justice in the Caribbean and Latin America. So Michael, thank you so much and welcome. Let's see, Michael, there we go.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to add my voice to this movement. I've been involved with this for a while. And I think at this point, I just wanted to lend my voice, having been raised by an engineer who became the first African-American scientist at EPA. Even before EPA was formed, it was my father who was part of the continuous air program in the 1960s. It was focused on air pollution in 10 cities. It was run under the Department of Health and Welfare. That data that he collected in this little geodesic laboratory downtown St. Louis led to Congress to pass NEPA. And that legislation got him moved into a position with the Environmental Protection Agency. So I followed his path, and I wound up in environmental chemistry, starting my first environmental laboratory job at Fort Tynes Beach. So can you still hear me?
We can hear you. There we go. Now we can see you.
Okay, now you got the video. Okay. Well, okay. So I have a voice in this effort, and where the movement is, and the voice that I have is one that I said started in a technical capacity, working with laboratories in St. Louis, starting my laboratory experience with environmental work with Tynes Beach. And I did that for 15 years, and I had a life-threatening injury, wound up working with nonprofit agencies. And then I received my first federal grant in 1994, and I spent 15 years in the nonprofit sector. So the voice I have is one of understanding the technical aspects of environmental issues, and then spending 15, 20 years working with community organizations. So just to be clear about what title you want to call me, I'll kind of wear many hats. I've worked for several agencies, organizations in education, and starting that with tag grants with Superfund. So the voice I have is really to try to reframe environmental justice. For instance, the first presenter was talking about Cahokia. And I thought that was very, very interesting for me because, as a civilization, there's beautiful work that he's done to show the integration of architecture into being an education model. But we need to look at the people. We cannot forget that the environmental justice is not all just about data and figuring out problems, which I will have a lot to say about that later on, but it's about the people. And we need to understand how that civilization in Cahokia were able to be in such harmony with their environment and as an urban city, and then moving into conversations about Pruitt-Igoe and kind of where we are today. So I have a little kind of unique experience, and I'm just happy to be able to put my voice to this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jennifer Colton. Jennifer Colton currently teaches photography at Washington University's Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts. Her work focuses on transitional landscapes and the histories of cultural and geographic space. Her photographic practice includes exploration of sites at the margins of the urban environment where resilience and ecological transformation are present. Colton's photographs address issues of erasure and visibility, focusing on landscapes that hold deep histories of environmental, racial, and social precariousness. Collaboration is embedded within Colton's work, where an interdisciplinary approach is part of a larger process of connecting with community, learning about local histories, and examining public space. It's your floor.
Thank you, everybody. Liz, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and I'm really excited to be hearing and in conversation with all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to show and share with you some photographs. Hang on a moment, let me do this. Let me put it into full screen mode. Hopefully that'll work, yes. Okay, so I'll just get right into it. As a couple of people have mentioned, whoa, I cannot advance these slides. All right, we did test all of this. It's not allowing me to advance my slides. It says my screen sharing is pause. Let me try one more thing here. All right. Let's stop the share, and I'm sorry, let me try again here. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so the photographs that that I make and have been making for the past 5, 6, 7 years now in a very concentrated way are primarily in this American bottom region of Illinois. The region, and you can see the map here, is about 175 square miles, or about 65 or 75 miles from north to south along the Mississippi River. And it's a particularly interesting and complex set of conditions that exist in this landscape. It's a landscape that is a wetland. So there's evidence of river water flooding and receding. I'll show you some more from a particular body of work that specifically looks at the flooding and the receding of river water. It's also a place that is filled with industry. And then, of course, the overlapping of the land and the industry itself exists in this space. It's also a place where Native American mounds, I mean, this was, of course, all Native American land, but Native American mounds, that some of which still exist, and some that have been erased from the landscape. And it's also a place where there is an enormous amount of material extraction, or the evidence of material extraction. I'm looking at that through the way in which I photograph, document, explore through this landscape. These extractions are both historically as well as in the contemporary time. And to work with photography to explore a kind of spatial complexity is something that I'm very interested in. I'm having trouble advancing my slide again. Oh, here we go. Okay. So, historically and through the present day, there is evidence, there are traces, there are markers of the erasures that exist. And as Michael was saying, I'm also very committed to looking at the ways in which people, sorry, my slides are doing their own thing here. The traces and the ways in which people are affected, and both present and the ways in which they have been ignored. So to think about how photography can be a vehicle or a voice for all kinds of questions and conditions. The last two photographs, this one and the previous one, were made at Cahokia and with the Cahokia Mound site. This photograph that's up on the slide on the screen here is from the one remaining house that exists on the Cahokia Mounds. This house and the subdivision that the house was part of is an interesting and kind of complicated story behind it. I was wanting to look at how, again, with these traces of humans, but also the ways in which we as, builders of an environment are contributing to and responsible for a certain kind of historical and cultural erasure. So I look at and ask questions with my photographs and ask, what is our responsibility to this land, and to sort of reshifting and re-examining the ways in which we tell stories and write histories. Obviously, the river flooding and receding of the waters is something that affects our environmental set of conditions. The ripple effect from that is very real. And I started photographing in the space between the levee and the river itself, a very wild space a space that is particularly, at least where I'm wandering and photographing, a space that is relatively untouched by most human beings. There's wildlife in this space, but it's a space that's been created because of the building of the levee system. And as you can see, this mixing of a very kind of wild landscape, rewilding of the landscape, as well as the industrial, markers of extraction and energy production. It all kind of coexists in this space together. And the last few slides I want to show are some documentation of a series of billboards that were up. I was commissioned by the St. Louis Art Museum to, and was able to position billboards in very specific places, sites that I chose because of their relationship to Native American mounds that have been erased from the landscape. And the photographs, and this is I should also mention, ongoing work that I do with Jesse Vogler, who was here at the Sam Fox School in the landscape architecture program, and we continue our work together in a project called Significant and Insignificant Mounds. So the billboards is a component of and an extension of that work, where the photographs that I've made in this contemporary landscape that we are speaking about, and positioned into these very specific sites. Sites that, in a way, the photographs, the billboards, the ways in which the work sort of resituates or reshapes an examination of history. And as I was saying before, one of my primary interests is in the ways in which photography can ask us to pay attention and ask questions about the ways in which histories have been written, and call attention to that. So all of my work, and you've just seen a sampling from a few different projects, they're all intertwined. They exist in this space of the American Bottom. You can, to see more views of the American Bottom, you can look at the website Charting the American Bottom, or theamericanbottom.org, or you can look at my website, and I've got a right down at the bottom of this slide, you can see the address to my website. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Our next panelist is Candice Borders. Candice Borders is a PhD candidate in American Studies and African American Studies at Yale University. She graduated from Washington University in St. Louis in 2017 with a Bachelor's of Art in American Culture Studies. Her interdisciplinary dissertation focuses on the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex of St. Louis and Black women's methods of resistance and refusal. Prior to starting her graduate studies, Candice was an editorial assistant for Black Perspectives, the blog of the African American Intellectual History Society, and worked as the PNC Arts Alive Fellow at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. She currently works as a Wordle gallery teacher at the Yale University Art Gallery. Take it away, Candice.
Thank you so much, Brett, and thank you, Liz, for inviting me to be on this panel. So I will be, I just want to make sure my screen is being shared because it disappeared for me.
Right now we can just see a black screen.
Okay.
I can see your mouse.
Okay. I'll just try it again. Weird.
That's odd. And we practiced all
this.
I guess this is just how it goes.
Okay, let's just Just bear with me for a second. Is that
Looks
working?
good.
Okay, okay, cool. So I will be sharing a little bit about my dissertation. I am in my 4th year in my PhD program and actually will be back in St. Louis this summer to start really doing a lot of the research for my project. So I'm excited to at least virtually be in community in St. Louis today. So my dissertation is called Towards a Method of Refusal, Black Women's Public Housing Activism in St. Louis, and essentially tells an interdisciplinary history of Black women's methods of advocating for themselves and for the right to decent housing between 1947 and 1980. Okay, great. So in the spring of 1968, the Pruitt-Igoe Neighborhood Corporation, a tenant-led group, issued a report on living conditions in the public housing project. It was called A Dream Deferred, and the report followed, quote, "The story of the valiant struggle residents of public housing are making against insurmountable odds. It is the story of people who, in their attempts to create better lives, are constantly thwarted by those charged with helping them," end quote. And at the end of the document, the Neighborhood Corporation concludes with the assertion that, quote, "The conditions which are endured by residents of Pruitt-Igoe are unendurable," end quote. So my dissertation is essentially guided by an attempt to understand specifically Black women's modes of life and endurance within a site considered unendurable. So here is an aerial view of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, and I found this in an archive in St. Louis in a, actually it's the cover of an environmental impact report. But just so that we're all on the same page, for those who aren't familiar with Pruitt-Igoe, it was a housing complex built in public housing complex built in 1954 as part of nationwide slum clearance efforts to clear largely Black neighborhoods in central cities with the hope of spurring business development. And so Pruitt-Igoe was both conceived as a dumping ground for the families that were left behind by slum clearance and to also prevent, quote, Negro expansion, end quote, into other parts of downtown. And indeed, as St. Louis historian Kiana K. Irvin contends, a central motivator for the development of public housing in St. Louis was to, quote, limit the mobility and access of poor and working class people of color, end quote. So by the mid-1960s, Pruitt-Igoe was notorious for its unsafe living conditions, high rates of crime, and decreasing occupancy rates. Public housing residents were also blamed and stigmatized for their poverty as the rhetoric of cultural pathology started to take hold across the country. And of course, this is that racist way of thinking that was popularized by what has become known as the Moynihan Report. And so under this framework, Black single mothers, poverty, and deviance became intertwined as poor Black women were deemed a problem and their uninhabitable living conditions in public housing were deemed as their own fault. So my dissertation asks, if Pruitt-Igoe was ultimately imagined as a site of Black enclosure, how did the largely Black women and their children who lived there survive in this unendurable space? How did they negotiate and resist everyday forms of spatial domination? And so whereas many studies of race and gender in public housing focus on housing policy or tenants' demands on the state, and I will add a caveat that I would say contemporary studies of public housing, because Joyce Ladner wrote an incredible monograph specifically on Pruitt-Igoe in the 60s. So that's a great book. But I contend that a framework of what I call refusal, or Black women's critique of their dispossession and their simultaneous world building practices, is necessary to narrate an expansive history of mid-20th century public housing in St. Louis. So my work draws upon the thinking of a scholar named Tina Campt, who is a Black feminist theorist of visual culture. And I really draw on her work, which focuses more on photography within the Black diaspora. So I use her to think a lot about a framework of refusal. So I understand refusal as a method in distinction to what we might think of as acts of resistance, a rejection of the categories of the dominant, and a productive practice for imagining forms of relation that exist beyond the material, ideological, and spatial logics of public housing. To practice refusal, then, is to insist on creating and maintaining alternative modes of community and relation while still inhabiting oppressive state logics. So my work hopes to theorize and is starting to theorize the ways that through their acts of refusal, Black women who lived in Pruitt-Igoe were really cultivating alternative modes of sociality and community building that ultimately reshape both the physical and social landscapes of public housing in St. Louis.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, moving right along, our next panelist speaker is Sylvester Brown. Sylvester Brown Jr. is a longtime St. Louis-based journalist and writer. He's the former publisher of Take 5 magazine, former columnist with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, contributor to the St. Louis American newspaper, also author of When We Listen, Recognizing the Potential of Urban Youth, and he also authored, illustrated, and did the narration for the audiobook of White Castles with Jesus and Uncle Ray at the Used Tire Shop. Please take it away, Sylvester. Oh, I think you're still muted. There we go.
Better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, honored to be here. Thank you, Brett, for the introduction. I was asked to use my journalistic lens to speak to the history of land use, biodiversity, and environmental justice or injustice in St. Louis. And I welcome the topic because it gave me a chance to reflect on my life and my writing and my career. To jump right into it, I was born and raised, I was one of 11 children born and raised in poverty in St. Louis. At about the age of 5, we moved to the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. That's where the new NGA plant, National Geospatial Agency, is being currently built. This was in the early 1960s. Now, at the time, neither my parents nor I, or anybody really, knew that the government was conducting secret chemical experiments on residents of Pruitt-Igoe. They were doing this because they believed that certain neighborhoods in Pruitt-Igoe matched neighborhoods in Russia that they might attack in the future. So these experiments occurred in the early 1950s, and then 10 years later, from 1963 to 1965. The Army used these motorized blowers atop low-income housing, high-rises. They did it from schools. They sent station wagons into the neighborhood that would spray potentially dangerous compounds, zinc cadmium sulfide. It's a fine fluorescent powder into already contaminated air in the neighborhood. And I distinctly remember seeing those trucks as a kid going through the neighborhood, blowing orange colored spray in the air. And talking to my mother and others, we were told that it was some sort of insect spray. So we didn't know. It wasn't until I started my magazine in the late 80s that I realized that the government was using my family and other residents of Pruitt-Igoe as guinea pigs for these experiments. Another impact on my life was after leaving Pruitt-Igoe, just when they were about to demolish the whole complex, we moved into ghetto home after ghetto home after ghetto home, all these homes that were built prior to 1978 when the government banned the use of lead paint. So I'm assuming all the homes we lived in were lead paint because it was estimated that more than 80% of the homes in the city contained lead paint. And as you probably know, exposure to high levels of lead can cause anemia, weakness, kidney, and brain damage. Now, I can't say for certain that we were impacted by that, but I do know that I had 2 brothers who was educationally challenged. They had to go to special schools. I myself I was not a good student. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't sit still. And I don't know if that was because of that or if just, I was a creative kid and teachers didn't know how to diagnose or deal with that in overcrowded classes. But I do know that we were in that environment. But again, it wasn't until I became a journalist that I learned the horrible statistics related to lead paint exposure that to this day still impacts youth in urban areas and others. For example, according to the St. Louis Health Department, Black children are nearly twice as likely as white children to test positive for elevated blood lead levels. In 2016, we learned that in several Black neighborhoods, Fairgrounds Park, O'Fallon Park, Kingsway East, had more than 20% of the kids test positive for high lead levels. Washington University did a report in 2019 entitled Environmental Racism in St. Louis, and we learned that Black children are more likely than white children to be treated in emergency rooms for asthma and suffer from high levels of lead poisoning. Again, it wasn't until I entered the world of journalism that I really learned about these things that I grew up in. I learned that people of color are more likely to die of environmental causes, and more than half of the people who live close to hazardous waste areas are people of color. This was noted by a group of Princeton graduates in the report, Racial Disparities in Climate Change. Honestly, after reading, researching, and writing about all these topics and other economic and health woes that people of my hue experience, I started to feel like a voyeur. I was someone who was peeking in, talking about, reporting about all these dire conditions, but I wasn't actually doing anything to address these problems. So my collective work had led me to the conclusion that the only way for the Black community to move forward, to move out of victimhood, move into the arena of social, education, and environmental empowerment would be through a self-sustaining do-for-self collective initiative. So in 2012, 3 years after leaving the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I started a nonprofit called the Sweet Potato Project. And the idea was to inspire entrepreneurism in young urban youth at an early age, from the ages of 16 to 21. We taught them entrepreneurship by having them plant food on vacant lots, sweet potatoes, harvesting that food, turning that food into a food-based product. Then we showed them marketing and advertising and other business skills so they can make money today, not after they got out of college, but to make money today in their own neighborhoods off something that they produce in their own neighborhoods. Unfortunately, after 7 years, the project never rose to the expectations of my imagination. Don't get me wrong, the youth really gravitated to this program, this whole idea of growing food and making their own TV commercials and rap videos and turning the food into food-based products. They grabbed that instantly, and they were down with it. The problem was that I imagined a much bigger initiative. I wanted government leaders, politicians, aldermen, the mayor, to actually give land to these kids we were training to grow food. I wanted them to give land to adults in the neighborhoods, in these low-income communities. I wanted to create an environment where food was an empowering economic force in the community. My vision was to not only have, regular people owning land, but to create a food manufacturing plant. We create our own brand, like Del Monte, or our own food brand, and start selling food out of the North community. I saw that as a way of not only protecting, preserving, and maintaining land, but I saw it having an economic incentive to do so. So we would expand land usage, and we would empower people in disadvantaged communities. It didn't work because I learned that I'm a writer. I'm not a delegator or a relegator. I'm not good at fundraising. And I'm really not a good nonprofit leader. The idea was good, and I still hope that someday I can bring in some institutions or work with institutions to make it work again. But I just couldn't get it off the ground to match my imagination. So I'm going to end part of my introduction there, but I want to end it by reiterating my firm belief that the best way to address environmental injustice in marginalized communities is to put the onus of change in the hands of the people living in those communities. If they have a reason to care, they have a reason to protect their neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvester. It's just such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Our next panelist, our next speaker is Dr. Whitney Anthony Sammy, an assistant professor of biology at the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy here in St. Louis. Her research interests focus on applied conservation and understanding anthropogenic effects on biodiversity. In 2018, she co-founded the St. Louis Wildlife Project, a partnership among local scientists with the aim of understanding wildlife ecology in the greater St. Louis area. So thank you for joining us, Whitney.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Liz and everyone. It is really an honor to be part of this panel and part of this conversation. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the St. Louis Wildlife Project, what we do and who we are, and the kind of projects that we're doing. And so, as Liz said, St. Louis Wildlife Project is this collaboration or partnership that myself and a couple of other scientists, Beth Barrow and Solney Adelstinson, established back in fall of 2018. So we basically monitor biodiversity in the city, specifically wildlife biodiversity. And this is also a partnership with an organization called UN, which stands for the Urban Wildlife Information Network. And this is an initiative based out of Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, whose purpose is to document and study urban wildlife around the world, and is a collaboration among more than 30 cities in North America, as well as a handful of other countries. And so in addition to that, our work here in St. Louis Wildlife Project is made possible by many, many regional partners. So we do our wildlife monitoring at a variety of green spaces, and there are a lot of different organizations that have permitted us access to do our work. And so what we're doing would not be possible without the support of a lot of different folks in this region. And so our project began in 2018 when we established a 40-kilometer urban to rural gradient transect for wildlife monitoring that basically follows the I-44 corridor. We call this our Henry Shaw transect. And we use a protocol developed by UN. It's a standardized wildlife monitoring protocol for camera trapping. And we know that many factors are distributed unequally throughout urban areas, things like proportion of green space, vegetation, impervious surface cover, and human population density. And studies tend to show that there's a lower biodiversity in areas that are more highly developed. And so that's something that we were thinking this transect would capture. So far, most of our monitoring has occurred with wildlife trail cameras, and we mostly are able to detect mammals with this method. And then over the past year, we've incorporated acoustic recorders that record sounds, and this has allowed us to also target other important taxonomic groups like birds and bats, which is really exciting. And so we have some overall goals for the St. Louis Wildlife Project. Obviously, we're curious about how landscape features affect diversity of wildlife and abundance of wildlife. But we also have a research or a community science and education component to the work that we do. And ultimately, we hope that the work that we do will contribute to a broader understanding of not only ecology, but also information that can help with sustainable and equitable urban planning. So a big component of our work is to ask questions about how animals are distributed across our urban to rural gradient. And so far, this is mostly mammals. And this is just a snapshot of some data that one of our students, a student from UHSP, Maddie Moylan, some data that she was working with from our very first season of camera trapping. And these are a few of our more common mammals that we see. You probably have seen most of these animals. And you can see right away that, you know, these animals are not found or detected equally across the gradient. You know, some are more common than others, and some don't show up in some sections of the transect, and so forth. Okay, so we look for patterns, and then we ask or ask additional questions or develop additional hypotheses to see what factors might explain these patterns. And so, for example, here's another project, another student project, where they were comparing the two squirrel species that we have in St. Louis. So we have gray squirrels and we have fox squirrels. And anecdotally, we noticed that we really only see fox squirrels in our more rural sites along our transect. And so we did a little analysis over our first year of data collection. And we found that when we look at a metric of urbanization, such as percent impervious surface, that there's not a strong relationship with gray squirrels. They're pretty much found everywhere along our transect. But when we look at fox squirrels, we see a negative correlation, where the more impervious surface, the lower the occupancy rate for fox squirrels. So in other words, the more urban an area is, the lower the occupancy rate for fox squirrels. So we can start to look at various factors in urbanization and how that might explain the overall patterns that we see. And again, one of our big goals is to promote human-wildlife coexistence through science and education. And our transect and the data that we collect, all the photo images that we collect thousands and thousands. And this has allowed opportunities to keep people involved in research or engaged during COVID. We have lots of students and student groups that work during the summer and throughout the school year. The Tyson Conservation Corp is one of those examples. We also have great relationships with various partners in the city, such as the Green City Coalition, Peace Park Community Advisory, and lots of other volunteers. You know, we encounter people, we're out working in public places. And so we often encounter people and they want to know what we're doing. And so it's really fun to talk about our project and the goals of our project with the community. And sometimes we get, these people are also interested in becoming involved in the project and end up doing some photo tagging for us or with us. And so that's a fun part of what we're doing. And then also through these great relationships that we've established with partners has formed this framework that makes it easier for other researchers and groups to get involved with biodiversity or wildlife monitoring in the city. So for example, Rachel Pijanowski's lab at WashU with her Pruitt-Igoe work. Liz, she's going to be doing some work with squirrel population structure along the transect. And so it's really sort of opened some doors to increasing opportunities to look at biodiversity in the city. And how what we do sort of ties in with this panel discussion today is that we know that there's heterogeneity in the landscape that affect biodiversity, and particularly in urban areas. And a lot of this is driven by social drivers. And this paper by Chris Schell and his collaborators is a really great paper that helps us think about, in a broad sense, how racism and social drivers impact biodiversity and ultimately ecology and evolutionary patterns. And so in this figure here, which I love, we have basically an illustration that helps show how systemic racism and inequality impacts urban landscape characteristics and heterogeneity. And so you may have residential segregation, such as redlining, which leads to restricted access of resources, which leads to heterogeneity and habitat, amount of habitat, quality of habitat, access to that habitat, which then affects ecology and evolutionary patterns and so on. And one of the important things that that ecologists need to recognize is that we need to incorporate these social drivers when we ask questions about biodiversity. And that's one direction that we're trying to do with St. Louis Wildlife Project, and also a direction of the UN network that we're part of, this multi-city collaboration that's studying biodiversity in cities. And so one of the great things that we're doing is we not only look at transit biodiversity in St. Louis, but we can also contribute data to these larger, broader studies. And some of these studies have started to address how some of the social impacts of human-wildlife relationships. And this is just highlighting a recent study, a UN study led by Seth Magley and Mason Fedino at Lincoln Park Zoo, where they looked at the luxury effect across 20 cities in North America. And the luxury effect is basically it's a positive correlation between neighborhood wealth and biodiversity. And just these are a couple of figures from that paper. And I pointed out, I just want to point this out because St. Louis is significant among these 20 cities. When in this paper, we looked at correlation between biodiversity and urbanization. We found that St. Louis, up here at the top, a very strong correlation with biodiversity and urbanization. So more urban areas in St. Louis have a lower species richness or a lower biodiversity. Also, in this study with regard to the luxury effect, so they looked at income as a measure of wealth, and St. Louis had the strongest effect. So what this shows is that is a positive correlation between income or wealth and species richness or biodiversity. So the wealthier the area, the more wildlife species there were. Okay. And then I also want to highlight the same group. Many of these same cities are currently participating in another study to evaluate gentrification influences biodiversity in cities or across cities. Now, one of the caveats of our project with regard to addressing questions about socioeconomic disparities and biodiversity is that our original transect, while it does a really good job of capturing that urban to rural gradient, it doesn't adequately capture the gradient, a socioeconomic gradient of this metro region. And so we are currently working to establish a second transect to better capture or better represent that socioeconomic gradient so that we can look at how biodiversity varies within a city with regard to the degree of residential segregation, and with the goal to help inform urban planning to improve green infrastructure and green space and equitable policy change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing with us. I'm gonna just kind of talk about what we're going to do next. So we are open to questions from the panelists to each other and also from our viewers on YouTube. So if you have a question, if you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and put that in the chat. And kind of the first question that I have is just broadly for all of our panelists. One of the things that I noticed about just land use when I moved to St. Louis is how kind of almost subtle things are involved with racism. So things like barriers at the ends of streets that you see driving all around St. Louis, the fact that there's private neighborhoods in St. Louis, the frequency of trash pickup or even dumpster replacement. I found a dumpster earlier this week that had been out for almost 20 years. You could tell just based on when they had the original pickup dates. So what kind of things do you see maybe that are changing the land use in these areas? If anybody wants to kind of speak on that or has any comments on that.
Well, I have a comment.
Yeah, Michael.
Okay, so and it's absolutely the reason I was interested in this, however, is titled Environmental Racism.
Michael, can you turn on your video so we can see your face?
Okay, let me see. Start video. Okay, I don't know. I can't get it up.
Okay, that's okay.
I can't get it up. It says start video. It's been disabled. Okay. So I mean,
okay, go ahead.
What I say, so what I say is more important than you looking at me say it. But I believe, like, you know, you're hitting on what I think should be a goal of this panel is to try to dissect really the causes. And when you talk about, you came here from somewhere else and you saw all of the street barriers. St. Louis has this history with redlining, the conflict between the city and the county. I myself have been a victim of gentrification myself in Tower Grove East when they kind of upgraded that Manchester corridor to Route 66. And I was working with a minority bookstore there. And we were just denied loan after loan after loan right on the corner of Tower Grove and Manchester until it was just clear that they were going to, land bank that and then upscale it. So I think that we need to really look at the policies. I mean, inspecting the results of racism is fine. But we need to discuss how do we deal with racism? And it is a systemic issue. And it involves politics. It involves more strategic pre-planning so we don't see the manifestations of these misuses of land. For instance, my mother grew up in Nashville. And so I frequently go to Nashville. And when this whole conversation today about land use and the interstate highway system, how do we dismantle that? Well, it's going to take a long time, but we can educate people about how the highway system has cut through those communities. And you don't just cut through the community physically. You cut through the culture of those communities, which makes those communities. It's not the buildings, it's not the property, it's not the real estate, it's the human estate. And when you cut through that with a highway, you separate those cultures. And then, as the young lady was talking about, how do minorities respond to that? It's beautiful. I mean, how those communities re-emerged. Sylvester was talking about Pruitt-Igoe. It's an interesting story with Pruitt-Igoe, and we need to stop analyzing what happened. We need to kind of look at where we are now today. And those things, what I'm looking at are this way to address the policies that are systemic. And we have governmental agencies that refuse to admit systemic racism. So how can we change environmental justice? Okay, so this is where this starts. And land use is just one of those issues of racism. Okay, but if we are still a country divided on how we delegate resources, then we'll just keep doing this. I've seen this for like 25, 30 years, same slideshow, same study, same knowledge. And then we want to make art out of the tragedy. I mean, it's nice to study, but I want to put my voice out there to say that we need to do better with communicating what is actually environmental justice and what is actually environmental racism. And it is systemic. And it does affect everything from land to food to wildlife to biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to see environmental justice organizations in St. Louis become more involved with the trade unions, with unions, to these labor laws. When my experience as an OSHA trainer, and we got $4 million to train people in green jobs. And I probably think 10 of them got hired because they got qualified. They got free training, solar, asbestos removal. These guys and young ladies went out into an industry that they ran into the same barrier of racism. So we have to talk about accountability, and we need to be looking at how we can impact some policy things and use this information, a collective effort. And that's where my voice is. One more thing I want to put out to the panelists that I'm concerned about as far as land use, and believe atmosphere is part of the land. Air pollution is part of this, is the ecosystem. There's like the land here. If you know the water cycle is all connected, right? Okay. So these dispersal of these chemical aerosols over downtown St. Louis mainly is part of a 15-year study about plumes, atmospheric plumes. And that is not being even addressed in the state's environmental justice agenda or the federal government. So it takes the voices of people, and that's why this is a people thing. The people are on the land, before they get displaced. And that we need to magnify that voice so that we just don't keep repeating these mistakes that we are doing in relationship to decision making.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. I want to follow up on that point, which I think is right on. Especially I'd like to hear from Candice and Sylvester on the idea of ownership and how that might be able to increase environmental justice. I think both Candice and Sylvester touched on this, especially Sylvester, but I'd also like to hear, Candice, perhaps when you were researching the women of Pruitt-Igoe, if they had actually owned these apartments, like would it have been different? And Sylvester, going with you too, right? About, people need to have ownership in the land, and that's going to allow them to, well, probably respect the land more. So both of you guys could talk about that. And another question that I'm wondering if anyone has the statistic for is, what's the proportion of ownership between the different races in St. Louis, right? How many people own houses based on race, and how many people are renting? Anyway, those are hopefully questions that follow from Michael's point.
Go right ahead, Candice.
So the question is, if people in Pruitt-Igoe owned their apartments?
Yeah, it was not owned, right? They're renting. And do you think had people had more ownership in this development? Now, of course, there was a lot that was just set up to fail with Pruitt-Igoe, but had ownership been a part of it, do you think the story would have been a bit different?
Well, so I'll clarify that my research is largely oral history based. So doing interviews with women that lived in Pruitt-Igoe. And in terms of the ownership, I'd be interested to hear what Sylvester has to say, because he actually lived there. I don't know if I can necessarily speak to that, but I think there's something about, I'm just broadly interested in the construct of private property. There's scholars that talk about how Black women especially were preyed upon and forced into purchasing homes that were actually basically set up for them to foreclose on. So I don't know. I think there's a deeper issue there around race and housing. And I would say too, I think housing is a basic human right. So whether you own it or rent it, it seems like I guess the ownership, if that would have been different, that kind of narrative seems to blame tenants for the issues that were plaguing Pruitt-Igoe, and that's something that a narrative that has been critiqued, I would say, by people who have written about Pruitt-Igoe or spoken about it, that it's not really tenants' fault for not caring for their space, because the women I spoke to were organizing and doing all that they could possibly do to make Pruitt-Igoe a livable space for themselves and their children.
So if I can interject 1 second, that wasn't the intention. My intention is more of, if you have ownership, right, you actually have the equity and you have the power over the land. So if anything, I think, by saying that they weren't able to own it is actually more on how a landlord or a governmental agency could actually continue to reduce the power of people living in an area. But yeah, I can also see it that way too, of saying like, well, they didn't own it, so they just let it go to
but they
shambles.
Didn't.
But right.
They
No, I can see that
didn't
argument. Right. But I can see how people would make that claim. But I think, again, had they had ownership, there might have been more power. At least they would have owned something, right? Like, and had it been like, if they were going to tear it down, the government would still have to buy that property from them. I don't know, Sylvester?
Well, ownership was not really an option in the Pruitt-Igoe era. Just wasn't set up that way, and there was no mechanism to buy Pruitt-Igoe. But if you've seen the film, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, and I'm sure most of you guys have, throughout that 20-year experiment, there was some really encouraging efforts by the people. They had the tenants ownership association, something like that, where, you know, the people came, you know, the tenants came together. They started to clean up the place, fix the place, paint the place. They worked with religious groups. So that there was power in a sense to that, but the odds were just too great. Now, I really want to go to the bigger picture to me is St. Louis has always, especially since 1950 to today, has put land improvement behind major development. The NGA site is a perfect example. There's plans for miles and miles around that area for development. Unfortunately, that does not include Black people, those who are around there now. And I predict that that area will drastically change as far as Black homes and businesses in that area within the next 10 years. So hearkening back to Michael's point, the key is the people. How do we excite the people about land ownership, about taking care of the land, owning the land, being watchdogs for the land? How do we do that? Because, you know, unfortunately, Black politicians, I think, place the same amount of value on Black neighborhoods and Black people as white politicians. Let's be real. They follow the money too. They're not visionary enough. They're not willing to step outside the box and say, hold on, if we're going to give 80% of city resources to these big developers, why can't we give 30 or 40% to these Black neighborhoods and do some real development in the neighborhoods that includes parks and waterways and other things that improve? Now, Michael got me thinking about something I've been passionate about. Who is the group that's most powerful, most influential, who has the most sway in the Black community, especially in the young urban Black community? Hip hop artists. Jay-Z, T.I., Queen Latifah, Akon, all these rappers are talking about buying the block, investing in their own community, reclaiming the community. That is the narrative that we need, not only for young people, but for, you know, some of these older folks who just don't see the big picture. So until we have a all-encompassing narrative that inspires African Americans, young and old, that inspires whites and others who are also engaged and invested in creating progressive, positive, healthy Black communities, we need a narrative. And I firmly believe that the hip hop generation can give the music, they can give the entertainment. They're already working together to create music and videos and also and clothing and all sorts of things. So if we can find some way to lift that narrative where it becomes magnetic to churches and Black business owners and even corporations who want to invest in it, then I think we have we have a musical message, somewhat like We Shall Overcome, that may lend to a massive reclaim the land movement that includes protecting our resources, bringing in new resources, planting trees, planting grass, planting food in these communities. But it has to be incentivized to the point where it has a personal economic impact on people's lives. That's just me.
Let's see, trying to figure it. There's my video on. So kind of, you know, talking off of what Michael said a few minutes ago, Jennifer, Nate, Whitney, I'm kind of curious how and if you're hoping that your work moves policy, or is your goal just to document, which is absolutely necessary, or are there applied kind of goals within your research, within your work? Nate already has his hand up, so I'm going to go with Nate first.
Sure, yeah. I had a kind of a question, but I think it dovetails into a response and question, into your question. I guess I'm trying to pulling from what everyone's saying, and kind of from the presentations from earlier on. I think I'm struggling with this balance between kind of having experts or people who do all of this and then they collaborate with other experts versus people who are kind of working between all of those categories, right? And that, Whitney, a lot of the research that you're doing is like, I'm trying to understand and follow I think the heavy science that's behind the work that you're doing. And like I guess like the question is how can we both work between these kind of almost fundamentally siloed disciplines, and how can we have the same people working between them, but also have experts that are doing that research that have that knowledge and expertise, and how can that all be collected and like coordinated at a larger policy scale? Because a lot of what we're describing, I think, does kind of manifest at in St. Louis is this systemic, is this historical, is this ongoing kind of trauma and issue, and that I think I feel both helpless a little bit, and like in architecture, you're working. Like you're given the development, the property, and you come in, you have a whatever percentage, and like there's a very limited framework of what architecture does that is experiential. That's how do you coordinate the materials? How do you make these decisions and think about what people need, of who's going to use this space? What's the long history? What's the history behind this space that's not being considered by the development of this project? And like, I don't know, I think I'm grappling with all these layers simultaneous to how do you fundamentally change and disrupt these issues that have continuing. Again, Michael, like you're saying, it's the same elements of the conversation for 25 years, for 30 years. And I don't know, it's not really an answer so much as the question of how do we work between those different disciplines, and also how do we disrupt the system of that, and how do we, I don't know, like learning from what people have done and from what you guys are doing at the same time of thinking of ways to integrate that into my own work, into my own practice as an architect, as a designer, and other ways. But yeah, sorry, it's a bit scatterbrained. I'm a bit tired, but just thinking of like, how do we connect those pieces?
Yeah, that's great, Nate. That, one of our hopes, I think, is to find a way to engage communities so that they, have some say, and, from all aspects of what we're doing, what do they want to know about the wildlife biodiversity in their areas? And then can we get them involved? Are they interested in being involved in helping with collect data in, the regions where they live, the parks where they like to spend time? And then basically seeing it, if we can use this as sort of an awareness of this is the wildlife you have, and then also helping to make a connection between there are studies that show that there are mental and physical health benefits with exposure to nature, and our hope is that maybe we can help make this connection with some of the work that we're doing. And then also what you're talking about, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I was thinking about this when Sylvester was talking about how do you get, when you're putting sort of the onus on the people, and, if they can develop this interest in learning about wildlife, for example, maybe that will help spur some change. But then, Nate, getting back to your question about how do we integrate all of this, the big change is going to have to be from policy. And one of our major goals is that the information that we collect can be used to help inform decisions about developing areas and developing green infrastructure. And I think this is something that has to be a collaboration between communities and ecologists and architects and planners, all sort of coming together to figure out what's needed, what's wanted in these communities. Peace Park at College Hill, in the College Hill community, I think is a kind of an example of this. We have a camera at Peace Park, and this was done in partnership with Green City Coalition and the Sam Fox School and the College Hill Community Advisory Committee. And they're in the process of sort of developing this park area. And I know there are a lot of different people involved in that, you know, from urban planners, architects to ecology folks like myself.
I can talk a little bit about how I work with photography. Both, you know, photography is a really interesting medium for its ability to both document and then also do something different and maybe along the lines of storytelling and community engagement. And I'm really interested in the ways in which photography does both of those things and can do both of those things simultaneously. And I think some of the slides that I had in my presentation dropped off, but one of the ways in which, and although many of my photographs or almost all of my photographs do not include the representation of people themselves, the engagement with people, my engagement with people, my long-term relationships that I've built over time with people in these communities that I wander around and I visit and revisit many, many times is really important. And one of the things, one of the slides that dropped out of my presentation that has to do with the ways in which the communities with, that I have formed relationships with, that I work with them in is in the form of the American Bottom Gazette, which it's a whole collaborative effort to look at the stories and the ways of storytelling that people who have their own histories that need amplifying in many different kinds of ways. So photography can be used as a way, as a companion to the voices of people who are living in communities that, and their lived lives. So I don't know if that's exactly addressing or answering any questions, but I think that the ways, at least for me, the ways in which photography can be used as a catalyst for awareness and repositioning the way in which we look at the present day as well as the histories of our spaces. It's kind of, the way in which I see my photographic work moving into the world and being in conversation with this particular landscape in which we all are kind of looking at in various ways.
Well, Jennifer, I'd like to say compliment you on your work, and photography and art do work hand in hand. My mom was an accomplished painter, and in that Ville community, she documented by painting a lot of the parks, a lot of the fountains that are no longer in those parks anymore. And she added people because these are places she visited her 90 years living there and raising 6 children. And I have all her collective work. And people are interested in it because they were looking at this art, just like your photography, side by side. They tell a story. Okay. So it is very, very important, not just for photography, but to go like the people in the land. It's the people in the land. It's just not the land use. It's the people made the land. The people are on the land to use it the way they should use it. They can use it. If they have been discriminated against, like that question about the ownership of land. Well, it was the United States government that kept minority communities from owning homes. I mean, it was intentional. It was intent behind how real estate and property was going to be delegated up to now. And so we're now trying to dismantle that. But the understanding of it is like, I think is kind of what I wanted to say to Nate, because that him struggling to understand how to put this together, to me, is the fruit of a panel discussion like this. We have to push the envelope on all of our disciplines. We have to be willing to come to the table as we are doing. And then for him to articulate his, that's pushing the envelope. You know, you're trying to push your field and merge it into other fields. You know, for instance, I'm a musician, I'm a scientist, but I'm a musician. So I study sound. I approach it, they're both one and the same. And when I started delving in the past 5 years into archaeoacoustics, I began to understand ancient civilizations, temples, land use, how sound was integrated in that. Now that I, as a musician, can go back and say that structure was built to magnify these sounds. And all of this stuff, it becomes very scientific too, but it becomes very sacred, which is telling that story. So Nate, I would say that in your field of architecture, within itself is a way for you to answer those questions you're asking the panel, which is how can you integrate the human environment into that design?
A lot of the work has been done, Nate. I remember Daniel Dioka with Harvard, I think, School of Architecture, came here several times, came to St. Louis with a group of students several times. They partnered with Washington University. And they went out into the streets, they interviewed organizations and groups, they looked at neighborhoods. All this is documented. They talked to a person, what an organization called Beloved Streets of America. His vision was to reimagine Martin Luther King Drive from Wellston all the way down to downtown across the river. I think that Wellston, St. Louis part was important. But the problem is there's this big void between academia, politics, and people on the street. The challenge should be, how do we make your work and other people's work here more pedestrian? How do we make it where the average person can grasp it, think about it, and put it into motion? And secondly, we need to put money behind the endeavors. If Washington University and Harvard University saw some value in investing and rebuilding Black communities, put some money behind it. Go to your alumni to put money behind it. Raise a couple of $1 million and say, we're going to do this. And all of a sudden you got attention and you got a blueprint. But again, the work is already done, Nate. So don't let that discourage you. Be challenged by the idea of how do we make it more pedestrian and how do we move it forward?
Nate, you had your hand up. I wanted to know if you wanted to respond or comment.
Yeah, again, a hybrid question response, you know, just kind of continuing. But Michael, I love your point about music. And I think of my dad as a minister, but like for him, he was also in a rock band. And for him, he was always connecting the two of making music and bringing that into his ministry. And for me, it's like, I wonder, and it sounds like you're doing this too. And psychoacoustics for me is a similar range of like these things that kind of sit between multiple different things that we silo. They're like, I don't know why we compartmentalize art, you know, or music from, I think, some of the science that you're talking about that's been presented in this research, like in this panel, and how, like, I guess if there's, I mean, in architecture, it's a lot of what we think about is minimizing acoustic damage, and that there's a lot of sound that you don't realize is affecting you when it is, and it's background noise, it's the highway, it's, you know, other issues of kind of controlling that. But I think there's also the kind of second dimension that's probably more explored in art, of how we can explore more emotions and how that connects and can activate kind of an energy for interest and change and action that comes with that, and the way that all of our kind of senses respond to stimuli. But yeah, I don't know where that's going, but I wonder if more connections like that across, again, all the kind of awesome different work that everyone has presented to kind of further a more collective front of what environmental injustice, and for people coming from different backgrounds affected, kind of coming from very different starting points, how that can all contribute to kind of more of a unified front, I guess, of justice, of change, kind of calling it out for being broken and understanding the underlying issues of racism and issues behind that, but how that can be kind of coordinated between everybody.
All right, excellent. Well, we are a little bit over our time, but this has been so enlightening and enjoyable that I'd like to still have a little bit more time of everyone here. So what I'd like to suggest is that each one of you, and maybe we'll go in reverse order from the way that people gave their talks, but if each one of you could just have a concluding remark on perhaps solutions towards mitigating all these effects that are so historical with environmental injustice, or whatever you want to basically end on, that's what you can do now. So we will start with Whitney.
Thank you. Well, I've really enjoyed this. I love storytelling, and so I really appreciate sort of the firsthand accounts. Sylvester growing up in Pruitt-Igoe. I would love to hear more about that. But I think it was you, Brett, you said a comment about something about proportion of racial ownership. And when we, we're developing this new transect to look at how, the gradient of socioeconomic effects of impacts biodiversity, we have to think really hard about different metrics to be able to quantify that. And when you said that, I made a note. I was like, that is definitely something that, maybe we should look at when we're trying to, quantify this gradient. And so I just wanted to say I appreciate that, and everyone else as well.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, really quickly on that. I mean, I live down in South City, and a lot of my neighbors, they own properties here and they manage properties in North City. And the way they talk about the neighborhoods in North City is not positive, right? And it's like, clearly, I don't know if you should be, working on houses and maintaining houses that you're not respecting the neighborhood. And that's one question I'm wondering about is, perhaps even if you're renting, like the ownership should be local, so that it's their neighborhood. But yeah, so anyway, it would be interesting to have that in the analysis. Sylvester.
I think I said, just about everything. To reiterate, I just think we have everything we need to move forward. I like what Michael was saying, especially about the musicians, because if we're going to do this movement, I think arts and music and photography, concerts, murals are an important part of any progressive revolution. So all that should be incorporated. But going from the project I had of teaching kids how to grow food and sell food, and expanding that outward, and again bringing in somehow finding a way to bring the entertainment industry in with the environmental justice organizations. That is the challenge. But again, being the eternal optimist, I think we have what we need. We just need to do it.
Excellent, thank you. I believe, Candice, you're next.
So lots of thoughts, hearing everyone share. I think as a historian, I definitely echo things that were said earlier about the inaccessibility of scholarship or study, and bridging those gaps to actually doing something in collaboration with the populations that are actually affected and have been affected. I think I know less about the environmental justice piece, but on a broad level, and I think what guides my research interests always is listening to Black women and centering strategies that have been developed and created by Black women for centuries. I think, like Sylvester said, what we have is here. I think it's about identifying it and looking maybe in places where we might not normally look. So that's what I'll end on.
Excellent, thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, my brain also is filled with a lot of things that I feel like I need to, sit and really just sit on and think about. The ways in which so many of these practices and processes that we all are engaged with, and people in our communities that we are, talking with and related to, all of these pieces, they're there, and how to synthesize all of this and how to work together. I think about that a lot. And I think about how, of course, I think about how photography can be used, as I said earlier, as a catalyst for initiating stories and initiating connections together. But, in a forward-looking way is something that is a new, like how to think about the future is kind of a new question that I've been asking, because I honestly am not a very optimistic person about the future. I mean, I kind of, and I'm trying to think about how we collectively can create conditions where we're examining our past as a way to move forward. And I feel like they're in that photography can play a role, and my work with writers and landscape architects and historians and storytellers are ways in which to possibly suggest both a looking back and a hopeful looking forward. I'm still struggling with that hopeful looking forward piece, frankly. But anyway, like having conversations like these, being part of conversations like these is really useful for me to put into place potential steps forward. The sweet potato project, Sylvester, I would love to see that reemerge in ways that were fulfilling and productive. That to me is something that is a positive, at least hopeful concept. Yeah, thank you.
Here's hoping.
Excellent, thank you, Jennifer. Michael, what's your closing remarks?
Okay, I have to close by saying that we need to affirm the sanctity of planet Earth, of the planet, of the people. So I want to affirm that to close this out, because this is what it's about. It's about the work. This is just not discussion. This is like, I feel the spirit of everyone here, and it is about work. And work is when you feel like Nathan was trying to articulate, that challenge in you to push the border, to open the envelope. My present work, and I want to say, behind the means and measures that we can promote the movement and ideals of the movement, and it's civil rights. And it's not just environmental racism and Black folks. I mean, white people are race too, and they've been discriminated against. So we've got to get past certain things. And, I just hope that will happen one day. I think that it's about the youth, that I have switched my energy to working with youth and in education, because that is where we can plant the seeds. And if we can collectively come together and put this multidisciplinary thing into the schools, into the youth, into the music, they will grab it. I mean, and that's my work I've been doing for the last 10 years, is focusing on the youth and youth organizations. I'm in the schools, and, I'm trying to get down on their level, see what they need. And if I can go through STEM, I'll just say this is STEM. But I right now, I'm really looking at a planetary impact of environmental justice. It involves all these things we're talking about. They're happening in every city and every place in the world. This idea of land use. So it is beyond racism. it's a human thing. And I think I had the opportunity to work with the Ogoni refugees who came here, I believe like in the 90s when Ken Sawariwa and Ogoni environmentalist was executed by the Nigerian government because of his protests in the Delta region with Royal Dutch Shell. After he was executed, his brother and his family, they wound up here in St. Louis, and through Chris King, I was able to make a connection with them and I helped them start addressing, when we did boycotts of Shell stations and whatnot, to talk about the Ogoni, who the Ogoni, okay? And that started another branch of my journey on this river. So it's like we're in a river, we're all in this current, and we're little fishes over here, there's ones over there, and that we can herd together. And that's what I think the beauty in this panel discussion is, because I probably never met any of you if this opportunity hadn't presented itself. So I want to say thank you to everybody who was responsible for making this happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And now I have a lot more I have to read about. I did not know anything that you just said about the Shell development and the Nigerian politics there. So yeah, tonight will be interesting looking into that. Nathan, you're our last one, I believe.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. Michael, feeling like a fish, but it's nice to see some other fish in the sea, the river as well. Yeah, I think, I don't know, I feel connected in that we're all storytellers. I feel like that's come up a bit, of the process of telling a story, of processing narratives, and just, yeah, I feel kind of called to follow that thread of translating kind of from one knowledge to the next to help communicate an idea in different ways and making that as public as possible. But yeah, I don't know. I thank you to everyone for this opportunity. And I tend a little more cynical, but it's conversations like this that I hopefully feel a little more optimistic.
Well, thank you so much to each and every one of our panelists. I just so thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. And to our sponsors, the Living Earth Collaborative and CRE2, the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, just thank you so much for participating today and for sharing in this wonderful conversation. I have so much to think about and to learn about still. And I really do enjoy living in St. Louis. And I thank all of you for being a part of this community. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.